back to Highly Respected. I'm your host, Scott Greer. Today we have a guest episode. I know those are very rare nowadays, but we have a special guest on, and this is a guy we haven't had on in a very long time. You may know him from Twitter. You may know him from memes. He has a Peter Vangel Avi, and his name is Peter Nemets. And of course, I'm welcoming Nemets on the podcast. Nemets, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Beautiful day out here in Las Vegas, Nevada. Thank you very much for having me on tonight, Scott.
Well, we're glad to have you, and we are not going to be talking about why Nemets's vax takes or his political predictions about American politics. We're going to be talking. There's been a lot of memes going around about Nemets and his predictions, and you placing bets on that. But we are not going to get in that. We're going to talk about the situation going on in Ukraine. The whole international news is abuzz and focused in on Ukraine because Russia is apparently going to invade. Vladimir Putin has massed over 100,000 troops around the Ukrainian border, and everyone's getting nervous, and people are talking in Washington, D.C. and elsewhere about this, and people are like, oh, should we send troops? Nemets is an expert on Ukraine and Russia. He's read a lot of books. He is, I believe, fluent in both languages, both Russian and Ukrainian. So he can give us an expert perspective on this. So the first question I want to, talk about is the current affairs. What do you think of this situation? Just from the broader picture of like relations between Russia and Ukraine in recent history, the last 10, 20 years or so. And do you think that Russia will invade Ukraine? What do you think that Putin is doing here by massing these troops on the border?
I haven't followed the situation as closely as a lot of the people in Washington have. Last kind of 7 years or so, it's very much been a stalemate in the Donetsk Basin, the Donbass, as it's shortened. It's the region that includes Donetsk and Lugansk, the two cities currently controlled by Russian separatists who wish for their region to rejoin Russia. Ukrainians, on the other hand, they very much want that part of their country back. They have stated many times their intention to retake it by force, and the Russians don't really want that to happen. Moscow very, very much wanted Crimea to be part of Russia. Actually had been part of Russia prior to 1956, I believe, when Nikita Khrushchev gave it to Ukraine, even though it was about 90% Russian speaking. And, the Donbass was always kind of like a sideshow to a lot of that. Putin, or the people in the Kremlin back in 2014, they actually called off the operation to seize the Donbass. And it was just because of a man by the name of Igor Shcholkov, or his real name is Igor Girkin, who invaded with some kind of Russian ultranationalists and, kind of forced that war upon both Ukraine and on Russia. But the Russians haven't really been enthusiastic about it. It's been kind of a source of financial problems for a lot of very powerful people there. And in my opinion, I think a lot of them would love nothing better than to give it back to Ukraine. Just at the same time, they don't want to appear weak and kind of give the anti-Russian forces, both domestic and foreign, kind of a victory over Russia, if that makes any sense. So their interest is kind of keeping the situation frozen. They don't want anything to change, and they're hoping they can use it as a bargaining chip to normalize relations with the West.
Yeah, I agree. I think the troops being massed on the border is a negotiation tactic. Putin is a smart negotiator, as Donald Trump would say. He's a tough negotiator. He knows how to do this. I mean, Putin has operated at a high level in politics for over 20 years, and he managed to have a firm iron grip on a chaotic country. So this guy, he knows what he's doing. He knows how to, look tough on a national stage, and he doesn't necessarily want war. The things that I've read is that it would come at a loss for Russia to take over that territory. I mean, the territory's been economically devastated. They would have to take over the social services and everything like that. They would have to pay for all this stuff. And, Russia isn't necessarily made of money at the moment, so they would inherit all the problems that go along with the Donbass. And the Russian government isn't exactly thrilled with this idea, but they're mainly concerned with, as you pointed out, is like Ukraine falling further into the Western orbit, and NATO pushing up to there. Because when the Soviet Union fell, they thought that NATO would not come to its borders, but NATO has come to its borders through the Baltic nations. And so they're very concerned about these nations on their border, Belarus and Ukraine, falling over to the west and joining NATO, and them having enemy or hostile troops on the border. So they're mainly concerned about how to continue to wield influence over Ukraine, but they don't necessarily want a war. And it's apparently working because Biden is reaching out to Putin. And even though, all these libs are very anti-Russia and, seem very eager for war, Biden is talking about allowing those eastern regions in Ukraine to have autonomy, or a much greater degree of autonomy, and being allowed to have better relations with Russia than the rest of the country. And, that's a negotiating tactic that a lot of the neoconservatives and many of the anti-Russian haters in the foreign policy blob aren't going to be happy with. But Biden also realizes that the American public doesn't really have a stomach for war, especially in Ukraine. Like, I think if we actually sent ground troops there to start, fighting, I think it would have like single digit support. Like, nobody wants us to fight another war, especially against Russia, especially against a serious, regional power, or even a possible world power, where we could take a lot of casualties, especially over something that we can't define. Like, most Americans don't give a shit about Ukraine, and they certainly don't want to be fighting and dying over there for a cause just to keep Russia or keep Ukraine within the Western orbit. So I think this is, as you said, this is mainly just a negotiation tactic. This is a smart guy. He's not gonna risk World War III over Donbass, and he doesn't really need to. I mean, he's already bringing the West to the table. Other countries in Europe will be amenable as well, and he will likely wring out concessions to pull out troops, some degree concessions. So we'll see what happens with that. So moving along to this point is, a lot of Americans aren't that familiar with Ukraine and Russia and the relations between each other. And one thing that's a debate, particularly on the right, is whether Ukraine is a real nation. This idea, I heard a lot of this idea back in 2014 when, Maidan occurred and then Russia occupied Crimea. And there was a whole spat within the dissident right over the time, whether we should side with Ukraine or Russia. And people got very heated about this. There was a lot of very serious feuds and brawls and turf disputes over this matter, even though, of course, Russia and Ukraine are very far away from the United States of America. But this divided the right everywhere in Europe and in America. But I remember this point being said that a lot of people would say is like, Ukraine's not even a country, it's supposed to be in Russia. What is your stance on this? Because this idea has now gone mainstream with Trump advisor Peter Navarro. He's one of the senior official in the Trump administration, was on TV saying Ukraine is not a real country. What say you to that idea that Ukraine is not a real country?
Certainly, I think it's a real country. It has a government, has an army, it has its own language. Even if you consider it a dialect of Russian, it's certainly, anyone can recognize Ukrainian for being, at least anyone in Eastern Europe recognize Ukrainian as being, different from Russian, even if they do share a lot of, have a lot of similarities. And now on the other hand, as far as like ethnically, racially, if you look at kind of their genetics, they're, more or less indistinguishable. If you kind of check out DNA from someone from Moscow, you're not going to be able to tell the difference from a person in Kiev necessarily. And there are some exceptions.
That's a way to unite. They could just take 23andMe and be like, we're actually brothers. I don't think that's
that,
work,
that doesn't. Yeah, that doesn't. There is certainly even more so than race a social construction to ethnicities. You have peoples that are very closely related to each other, like Russians and Ukrainians, that can nonetheless have distinct identities from each other. I mean, I think Turkey is the most infamous example of this, where they all militantly consider themselves Turkish and identify with the peoples of Central Asia, even though they're usually more closely related to like Georgians, Armenians, and Greeks.
People that they can't. Yeah, well, that's always the funniest thing is like, but one of the funniest things that I think a lot of Americans, or at least, dissident and right, don't understand is how closely related these groups are. Because most of our conflicts are in America are with groups that are very different genetically, look very different. We all speak the same language here, but there are serious differences between us that are very noticeable in public. But this is very common throughout the world. It's like Greeks and Turks absolutely hate each other, but if they look at their genetic profile, it's fairly similar. Greeks and Turks will both be outraged at this. I know there may be some Greek listeners out there who may try to come out and murder me, but I am merely a messenger. There are other important cultural differences between Greeks and Turks. I'm not saying they're the same people, but we know what they on a genetic profile they look the same. But it's also the same in the Balkans with Croats and Serbs. Croats and Serbs even speak the same language. There are some, they write it differently, and when you look at it, and if you probably looked at a genetic profile, you'd see them exact same. But they viciously hate each other. And the same with Bosniaks, is that all three of those groups are likely genetically the same, and they all speak the same language. But they're separated by religion and culture. And this is something that some people on the right, especially back in the days of pre-Trump era, where everyone was talking about pan-Europeanism and no more brothers wars. And that was a response to a lot of the Russia and Ukraine. It's like, but you guys are just so similar. Why don't you guys get along? But it's, looking at the world today, even especially these very nationalist countries that are, far less paused and far less corrupted by Western liberalism, such as, the Balkans and Greece and Turkey. Well, Greece, that may be a different scenario, but even in Ukraine and Russia, they still have these strong ethnic feuds and strong ethnic hatreds. And simply just saying no more brothers wars and we're all white together or whatever, that doesn't change how they are. You can explain this even in America, where you're going to have more problems with a group next door to you, and this has always been the way for humanity. Even though you and that group may have more in common than some group very, very, very far away, that group very, very far away is not a concern to you. What's concerned to you is the group near you that seems to have conflicts with, that you have a history of bad blood with, that you have important cultural differences that you feel, make you a unique people and separate you from those other people. And that's how humanity's been. I don't think, seeing all these conflicts between various European groups, particularly in Eastern Europe, does show, that pan-Europeanism doesn't necessarily work, where nationalism is at its strongest, and where a lot of you're familiar with is that, a lot of right-wingers in America tended now, especially compared to 2014, where we're not really seeing the Ukrainian nationalists in the street. And so most people are sympathizing more with the Russian side. They see Russia as the great opponent of the globalist American empire, the GAE, you can you can say the acronym however you want. And then, so we see Russia and we see Putin as these strong figures. So people are going to be more likely to sympathize with them than they are going to see with Ukraine, which they see Ukraine as this corrupt government that's dominated by international interests. It's ruled by these oligarchs that are almost comically like they're almost movie villain style, like how they rule the country. And you see that all these terrible neocons are like, oh, we love Ukraine, stand you with Ukraine. So the nationalists aren't really being highlighted anymore, especially now because liberal media wants to create more sympathy for Ukraine among the powerful sectors within American society. So they're not going to be going in and showing off Azov Battalion or right sector or any of these other nationalist groups. But there's still a very strong element within the Ukrainian state and within Ukrainian society. And without them, if you can say I'm wrong if I am wrong. The Ukrainian nationalists, without that hardcore element, there would be nobody to defend Ukraine from Russia. Is that correct?
That was definitely true in 2014. I don't think that's true today. Now that the military's been, much better organized and equipped, they're not reliant on the volunteer nationalist units like they used to be.
I am mistaken. I am mistaken on that regard. But you've seen a lot of the nationalist movement up close. What would be your thoughts on the current state of it now in 2021 compared to 2014?
So, here in the United States, we're a very spread out country. There's a lot of different metro areas, a lot of different kind of power structures. Everything's much more horizontal, even though things are kind of becoming more vertical in Washington, D.C. There's still like power blocks and, San Francisco with like Gavin Newsom and that kind of clique. You have like the New York people, you have like the Florida clique, that kind of stuff. And then there are some states like Wyoming that, yeah, they have their own political cliques, but culturally, they don't really matter. They just have some Senate votes, get some legislation, and, if that makes any sense. So, every country, I think, is pretty similar. You have these social networks that develop around different cultural elements, and you can leverage them into political movements. And this is what's, Eastern Europe is no exception to that. So, you go and you have the city of Kharkov or Kharkiv in eastern Ukraine. It's predominantly Russian speaking. It's an industrial city. And it's also kind of a center for, a certain type of Ukrainian nationalist.
That's true. All the great black metal bands come from Kharkov.
Yes, and they're all
hardcore nationalists too, which some of them may be ethnically Russian, or speak Russian on a daily basis, but they're all like talking about Slava Ukraini. That's what they all sing about in their songs. But they're from Kharkov, which at one point was very Russian.
Oh, I mean, it was the old Cossack capital too, and it was the capital of Ukraine at one point as well, prior to Kiev. So, even though it's very heavily influenced by Russian, and most of the people there speak Russian, most people do consider themselves to be Ukrainian. I think Ireland's kind of a good, comparison. They speak English, but none of them consider themselves to be English, and many of them, up until recently, militantly hated the English.
Correct. They still hate the English.
Still hate them. Yeah, you would know more than I would. I am not Irish at all, so.
I'm only a quarter. Some people always accuse me of being a secret potato person, but I am only a quarter Irish. So don't lump me in with all the bad traits. I'm only a quarter.
I'll take your word for it. I was thinking that you were part of the Celtic clique that's kind of forming in these circles.
No, as you can tell by my name, I'm mostly Scottish. Scottish and English, but in America, most of the Scots who came here were lowland Scots. Scots is a Germanic language. It's similar to English. There's a lot of English. There's the genetic profile between lowland Scots and English are very similar. And lowland Scots also populated Northern Ireland. And they're the most devoted people to British identity, even more so than the English. So even in America, the difference between Scots and English are very, mixed. But I like the term Anglo-Celt anyway, as we talked about with our good friend Irk a lot on this podcast.
Well, going back to kind of our discussion for Ukraine. So, that Kharkov clique is pretty influential. I think Andrei Bieletsky, kind of the leader of the civilian wing of Azov, who was at the front lines, he was from Kharkov and involved kind of in that black metal MMA scene as well. They had a very kind of militant street movement. They, there's a trial, I think it was back in 2011, and two of their guys blew up a Lenin statue, for Vladimir Lenin, the communist who founded the Soviet Union. And their guys ended up spending 2 years or 3 years in prison up until they got liberated after the Maidan Revolution, the Revolution of Dignity, early 2014. So some pretty serious guys who were able to convert their kind of street movements, student associations, and music like groupies, I guess, and football hooligans into a core of a fighting force. So that's kind of one element. And they tend to be very like atheistic or pagan. They have like this Roman revival that's been going on for the last decade, which is pretty interesting. They worship Mithras, the old Roman legionary god that some of the legions worshipped.
The head of Azov, I forget his name. You may have even mentioned his name. He is a practitioner of Radnovery, which is Slavic paganism. But like the funny thing is like these black metal bands that are like really nationalistic, like Nocturnal Mortem and Crota and all these other bands, they like indulge in like Norse paganism, which they're primarily Slavic nation. I don't know how that works out, but they do, and sometimes they add like the Slavic element. But yeah, these are not with that one element of Ukrainian nationalist. I mean, they're not the only element. Is this something that's not very it's something that's very different from what we associate with Russian nationalism, of like this ultra orthodox thing that's we're going back to a lot of the identity that Russia had in the 19th century or whatever they want to go back to. But with the Ukrainians, it's this more it's almost going back to this primordial type of identity, and maybe that's a part that the reason why they go back deeper in their roots, or it's a little bit more prevalent or at the mainstream Ukrainian nationalism versus Russian nationalism, Polish nationalism, is that Ukraine doesn't necessarily have as strong of its state history over long or as a concrete of a state history and a national history as Russia and Poland do, even though Poland especially has had problems with being an occupied people. But I think there's been always a better sense of like who is Polish, what is Poland, than with Ukraine. And that's why we now get these arguments that Ukraine is not a real country. Very few people, except for some Germans we may know, will say that very few people will say that Poland is not a real country, and very few people, I don't think anyone would ever say Russia is not a real country. But now we do have those arguments with Ukraine, and I think that's what leads to Ukrainian nationalists going down things that in America we would associate with being very strange. You would not associate. It would be very weird for an American nationalist group that is mainstream, that's respected by powerful political forces, to be hosting black metal shows and having like normal like right-wing teenagers there, and that being like their social events and stuff. But that's what's normal in Ukraine.
I wouldn't say it's normal. It's definitely a lot more accepted.
It's still normal, maybe taking it too far, but it's something that it's something that happens there that would not happen elsewhere. And it's still, being associated with elements that aren't necessarily in charge of the government, but they are not necessarily extreme, like fringe, like weird elements that like no one, that are like tightly enclosed in a ghetto, like some of these right-wing groups that we have in Europe and America. So this is, those events do attract, a few thousand people, which, those are really good numbers compared to what like right-wing events have in America. Probably about the same amount of people, slightly more people attend CPAC than attend Asgard's Rye, which is their black metal show that is associated with Azov. And that is something to say there. I know what you mean by normal. It's not necessarily like whatever middle class it is in Ukraine is going up to these black metal shows like, oh, this is what we like to do on a Saturday evening. But it is something that is not so. It's something that would be considered extremely weird and fringe, and just nobody would attend that. In Ukraine, it is, a somewhat of a big event among the nationalist scene. So that's what the point I was making. And you can correct me if I'm wrong in asserting that.
That sounds about right. There's, maybe 1% of the population that kind of has those sorts of views, and they can, draw from them a lot more openly than they can in other countries. since they are part of the power structure. They have people in the bureaucracy and the military that are sympathetic to that point of view, and they're probably overrepresented in the military due to their contributions in the 2014 war.
I think the president met with some of these groups. Well, the one thing is the president and the vice president sometimes, there was a controversy with one of the leaders in the government. I don't know if they have like a vice president or what necessarily the term would be, but he like attended one of these it wasn't a black metal show, but it was another like band that was like that they would call like a hate rock band, and he was like there on stage, and they're like, by the way, we have this guy from the presidential cabinet here on stage, and they're like, what the hell is this guy doing at this show? And he's like openly there, and the president has or a lot of the other leaders meet with these people that a lot of American journalists complain about as like the neo-Nazi element in Ukraine, and the Jewish president meets with them. And, it's a very bizarre situation in Ukraine.
Yeah, it's certainly interesting. They really like kind of the interwar Central European aesthetic, to say the least. But at the same time, they do believe they have their own entirely independent ideology. Azov itself believes in kind of the conservative revolutionary thinkers. Oswald Spengler, Ernst Jünger, are profound influences on them. And at the same time, they've been influenced by certain thinkers in the 1970s of the United States and United Kingdom. Found some interesting translations from some right-wing 1970s groups from the United States and Kiev. There's also the large foreign element, which I don't think should be underrated. You have all these like Germans, Scandinavians, Croats, whatnot, that are Poles too, that are involved in this stuff as well. So it does give kind of a pan-European feel to Ukrainian nationalism and that in that specific subculture.
No, I agree, and the shows that they have attract bands from all over Europe to perform as well. I mean, and people travel all over from Europe to attend. Even some people from the New World attend to these shows. So but it's all to gin up, recruits to fight, or at least in the 2014 era. I don't know necessarily. I think that Ukraine may not want as many foreign volunteers anymore, because they're having a lot of issues with some of these foreign volunteers, particularly some of the American ones. Some of the Americans who went over there came back, and these people were already psychos, and they committed murders here, and then they fled back to Ukraine, and they're trying to fight extradition. At least one guy is, and it's creating a lot of bad press for Ukraine, and Ukraine may not want to have all these various extremists from all over the world coming to fight in their wars as much as they would before. I mean, as you said before, they now have an army that's been trained by people, Western operators, and they would think that they would be able to hold their own in a war against Russia, or at least some semblance of their own against Russia, and they would not want to rely on these foreign volunteers as much. But foreign volunteers were a big part in the 2014 conflict. But one thing is that right-wing extremists fought on both sides for Russia and Ukraine. I think it just depended on the country. Like Greeks and even some American right-wing extremists would be found among the Russians, while like Swedes, Germans, Croats, as you mentioned, would be some other Western Europeans would be more likely to be found on the Ukrainian side. So, you're having your own little brothers, pan-European brothers war happening in the Donbass to a certain extent. So it is just like a crazy situation in Ukraine. And some of the things we've been alluding to, just like the bizarre nature of Ukrainian politics and Ukrainian society. What do you think about the prospects of the Ukraine staying out of Russia's orbit going into the future?
I think it's pretty much inevitable. Russians and Ukrainians had gotten along quite well since 1991. Small nationalist communities, and conflicts aside. all the way up until 2013 and 2014. A lot of Ukrainians have Russian ancestry, a lot of Russians have Ukrainian ancestry. There's very deep connections between both countries. And, even today, they get along fairly well, and there's not too much, ethnic animosity towards each other, even though, there is a lot of hatred towards the government in Kiev or the government in Moscow. But what happened?
You're saying that Russian, because there's a lot of ethnic Russians in Ukraine, that there is not, this dividing line necessarily between ethnic Russians and ethnic Ukrainians, as one would think. It's more of it's more of a political split than an ethnic split, you would argue.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And it's very much a linguistic split as well. The Russian has been kind of restricted in academia and business, and in education, media and everything in Ukraine. So people are kind of, especially the younger generations, tend to be more Ukrainian speaking than the older generations, Russian speaking. And part of that is due to differential fertility. The Catholic Ukrainians in the West tended to, have more kids than the Orthodox or atheistic Russians in the East, who, unfortunately have a lot of Soviet era, social maladies with, drug use, abortion, sexually transmitted diseases, that kind of thing. So even before, 2014, even going back to like the 1970s, 1980s, the trend was definitely, with the movement of these Ukrainian-speaking rural people moving into the cities, was to, turn the power structures of Ukraine into, increasingly Ukrainian rather than increasingly Russian. And 2014, I think, kind of sealed that deal permanently. So the Donbass will continue to integrate with Russia, their leadership and their people.
And Crimea is going to stay in Russian hands.
Yeah, Crimea was like, it stayed 90% Russian speaking all through the Ukrainian years and never cared at all. It was just kind of an accident of history that they ended up being part of Ukraine. Whereas the Donbass, I think, the Donbass, there was, it's dominated by the two great industrial cities, Donetsk and Lugansk. And, the rural areas were still pro-Ukrainian, though, and those were the areas that did not have their votes counted in that independence referendum, in May 2014. Those were the areas where the Ukrainians had, a lot more support. If you actually read the kind of Russian separatists who went to fight in the Donbass, they specifically avoided areas that had a lot of Ukrainian support, and stuck to the major urban centers.
Yeah, that's interesting. So what you're arguing is that pretty much outside Donbass and outside Crimea, that Ukraine itself is going to undergo increasing Ukrainification, where fewer and fewer people are going to be speaking Russian. The ethnic Russians who live there are essentially, due to the similarities between ethnic Russians and ethnic Ukrainians, that they're just going to become ethnic Ukrainians over time. And that the state, over time, that Donbass may separate from Ukraine depending on the situation. And Crimea is probably never going to be part of Ukraine again. That's what's going to mainly happen, is that this split between Russians and Ukrainians is going to effectively end, or is effectively going to be no more in the future within Ukraine.
I think they'll continue to, split apart. The Russians will gradually disappear from low fertility and emigration. The Ukrainians will kind of increase in their share of the population, but decline in overall population. And then probably around mid-century, they'll start to decrease as a percentage of the population. Kind of monolingual, English speakers will, start to take over, mostly from Africa and India.
Well, that might be a little blackpilling, Nemets. I do have to warn people that Nemets, he is a very smart individual, but sometimes he gets a little pessimistic about things happening. I hope that Indians and Africans and others will not take over Ukraine. I think that one thing is that Ukraine's economy is worse than Nigeria's. at this moment. If I'm not mistaken, its economy has worsened since Maidan. It's one of the few economies where it's like the 2010s, like it was marked a noticeable decline. So maybe that may keep immigration away, and also the fact that Ukrainians have a very strong sense of identity and they don't particularly like outsiders and foreigners coming into their country. It's one of the few European countries where they could not. They try to host BLM protests. I mean, there was BLM protests in like Helsinki and other places where I don't think they have a single black person. And they tried, I think some African immigrants tried to do that in Lviv. Of course, I'm mispronouncing all these names. Or Odessa. I think it's actually Odessa. And the locals just chased them away because they were so outraged that somebody would have a Black Lives Matter sign in Odessa. So that is like one, like, you know, there are many problems with Ukraine. Its economy sucks. It's ruled by corrupt, it's controlled by corrupt oligarchs. But at least in this run regard, you know, I don't think it's going to be a hotspot for immigration in the near future. I mean, of course, this could all change, but you know, I like to think positively. I don't know if it's the most positive white pill thought to think that, you know, immigrants will not move to the poorest country in Europe, but you know, it's one positive thing to think about. But going on that topic is, what do you see as the near political future of Ukraine? We talked a lot about the Ukrainian nationalists and how, you know, powerful elements in the country are allied with them and meet with them. But the thing to note is that nationalist parties do very poorly in their elections. I mean, all the big nationalist parties combined to support one presidential candidate in their last presidential election. I think that was in 2019 or 2018, if I'm not mistaken, where the comedian won. And that person, I don't even think, got 5% of the vote. And this is Svoboda and Azov's political party and some other nationalist elements all came together to support one person, and it didn't even hit 5%. And it's the same in the parliamentary elections. Like Svoboda, which was the big nationalist party prior to Maidan, it had a strong presence in parliament. It's seen its support dramatically reduce since then. And you would think that, like, well, nationalists have no presence, but you know, unlike in Germany, where AfD has a pretty strong presence in their elected bodies, but the whole country is like anti-nationalist. You know, in Ukraine, the nationalists have very little representation in the parliamentary bodies, yet they have more institutional power and more respect from the rest of society. So that's something interesting. But what do you see as the political future for Ukraine?
Oh, it's hard to say. Just like the United States, there's a lot of randomness in any kind of political system. You know, Zelensky's had a lot of protests he's had to deal with, you know, with the proposed agricultural reforms, you know, where they want to modernize agriculture and, you know, which of course would involve a lot of people in these kind of state-backed companies losing their nice, cushy government jobs. So of course, you know, outraged by that. You know, so that could cause issues for him in the future. You know, as well as all the unlimited scandals that he has from being, you know, an oligarchical puppet. You know, the United States, you know, views Ukraine as a puppet regime. You know, so you have the FBI and, you know, Western NGOs that regularly meddle in their finances and in their government. There's that aspect too, you know, and that's widely resented. You know, that's popular for random, you know, foreigners, you know, nothing about Ukraine to be, you know, benefiting from its wealth. You know, I think one of Biden's sons was, you know, being paid absurd amounts of money to be on the board of Ukraine's gas company. You know,
Yes.
that's just the tip of the iceberg as far as kind of the foreign colonization. You know, if you
Well, and it's also the fact that Trump felt he could order Ukraine. I mean, even with the phone call, it's like Ukraine and them telling them, like, hey, you should open an investigation into this Hunter Biden's corruption. You know, people are like, how dare he do that to another country? And it's like, well, Ukraine like depends on us to like survive. And it is like, yeah, it's like Trump was just more open than these other people. Like, I mean, you know, Biden pretends this is like an independent, strong nation that can survive without us. Well, Trump was like honest. He's like, this is like our, like, without us, they would be nothing. I mean, they would be controlled by Russia, which is true. And there's that point that they need to be made. And it's like, well, when we make a request, you should probably follow that. But how does that, you were saying that that's being resented. How does the Ukrainian nationalists, or even just the ordinary Ukrainian, respond or view this Western colonization that's happening right now?
That's a big question. You have some of the older people who grew up in the Soviet Union that despise the United States for being, anti-communist, anti-Soviet, or whatever, and they tend to support the Social Democrats. You also have some old people, particularly in the West, who are Catholics, who unconditionally admire the United States for, being the bastion of the, international right against the, communist threats of Russia and China. Very boomerish stuff. You have like a lot of younger people, particularly educated ones in Kiev, who are very sympathetic to the United States as a promoter of social liberalism, especially if they can understand some English. They'll watch American televisions, watch American films. They'll emulate kind of American customs.
They will not be listening to the great Ukrainian black metal that they have. They'll be listening to Kanye.
Yeah, it's honestly kind of depressing when you go there and it's like random rap and hip hop on the radio. Very.
That's unfortunately like most of Europe now. I mean, rap has taken over Europe.
Well, it's not as big in kind of provincial Russia. Like in Tatarstan, I think I only heard
one place we could be free of rap music is rural Russia.
Well, they have their own rap music. I just said, not English rap music. Yeah, like the Tatars have their own, like, very, Middle Eastern thing going on. Just a weird fusion. Very cool. I love Tatarstan. But yeah, Ukraine, a lot of very westernized young people for sure. And that goes for kind of younger right-wing people too, who are profoundly influenced by the stuff that's going on here in the United States. Like whether kind of positive mainstream figures like admiration for Donald Trump, Azov very much admired him, kind of viewed him, Le Pen's in France as, being their allies, against, again, kind of what they view as a resurgent communist threat to the East. Putin's gangsterism and his Soviet holdovers. But of course, corruption is the most resented thing by far. People just embezzling money, or especially from companies that should be providing jobs, and they just go and dump pollution into the water, which is something that happened at Krivoy Rog under Indian management. Mittal bought it out, and they hired a bunch of Indian engineers who replaced the Ukrainian engineers. That was like 15 years ago, but the pollution's still pretty bad there. So there's kind of that too. And then you have the Germans who are extremely influential there. They control just so much of the economy through finance and through they have a lot of like aftermarket part manufacturers that are in the supply chains of the kind of auto manufacturers in Germany. And those are just everywhere. Like you just drive on the road and you're certain to see German cars and trucks with German corporate names on them and everything. And the Germans are actually admired for that. I was really surprised for a country that suffered so much under Germany. And pretty much anywhere I went in the country, people were like, "Oh yeah, we really admire Germany. They have relatives in Germany. Work for German companies, and they really like the Germans." Even though the Germans, they play a really big role in promoting the kind of homosexual movement there. Kind of dominate sex tourism, both with women and men. So it's kind of interesting the Germans get a free pass on their exploitation of the country. Probably related.
They've always exploited Ukraine. It's historical, and that's what they wanted to do as one of their World War II goals. But one other thing, quick thing is how Ukrainian nationalists handle or view. One thing that we always talk about in the podcast is how various countries view their past in World War II, and it is interesting with this. Of course, like Germany has National Guild over it. America's World War II image is now being tried to retcon into some multicultural fantasy. Russia has turned it into something that is a grand nationalist epic. Japan is still proud of its World War II history, even though it lost, but it's like honors its heroes. And others, it's very different from Germany. But how does Ukraine, which was a part of the Soviet Union, but wasn't exactly happy to be part of the Soviet Union, of course, they had the Holodomor, and they were very much suffering under Stalin's policies, but they also German occupation wasn't was not a vacation either for them. So how did the Ukrainian national memory situate around World War II? Because there's also Stepan Bandera is a hero to Ukrainian nationalists, and he at one point in time collaborated with the German government or the Germans in World War II after being imprisoned by them, and then he had a complicated relationship, but is usually considered a collaborator in the latter parts of the war when he became a guerrilla, anti-Soviet guerrilla. But so how does that work? How does the national memory work in regards to World War II?
There's kind of three main takes. The largest take, which I would say probably like 60% of the population believes in, is that Ukraine was the ultimate victim of World War II. You had the kind of horrible Soviets. They're doing the collectivized farming, starving their people to death. There's all these Russian colonists that are moving in from the Volga and settling in the east. And then of course you have the Nazis that move in, and they originally think that they're going to be like the Germans from the German Empire, Austria-Hungary, who are nice, and they developed Ukraine, built the gas industry in the 1910s and stuff. And of course it was Hitler was psychopathic and was like, oh yeah, Ukrainians are subhumans, and just started like massacring all the Ukrainians that went to help them in the beginning, at least for the first year and a half of the war. He arrests Stepan Bandera, they shoot a bunch of the poets in Kiev, just not fun stuff. So, get fought over, tons of people die, they're the ultimate victims, and that's the most popular view. The next most popular view, is basically everything sucks, and they hate the Russians for glorifying it. But they're still proud of the stuff some of their armed units did. One of the armies was named I think the Second Ukrainian Army or something. I'm not a big World War II buff, but they're a big part of some of the big battles on the Eastern Front where the Axis got steamrollered.
Okay.
It's 60% of the population believes that. So the next view, 30%, is the Soviet view. The Soviet Union did nothing wrong. Ukraine was the forge, the anvil, and the sword of the Eastern world against the ravaging fascist hordes. Which is pretty true. They contributed, I think it was 8 million soldiers from Ukraine were part of the Red Army. You had the Donbass, which was this huge armament center. You had these really brutal battles, Kharkov or Kharkiv had 4 huge battles that got fought over. The whole city was just leveled. And they view their sacrifice as sacrifice for all of humanity, really. Maybe half those people support Russia covertly, if not openly. The Donbass separatists were really big on that stuff too. They're oh yeah, we're just fighting for the same stuff our ancestors did when we were storming back across the Ukraine in 1943 and 1944. So, and some of them view Russia's attitudes towards the Donbass as a betrayal. Rather than being kind of friendly countries, they're viewing them as betraying that Soviet promise, of peace and unity and all of that. So that's 90% of the population, and that's basically everyone east of the old what used to be Galicia and Bohemia and Transcarpathia, believes one of those two things. In the far west, it gets kind of interesting. So for Ukraine, is traditionally, most of the country is in the Dnieper River basin. So way back in the Middle Ages, everyone kind of all the rivers would feed into the Dnieper. They'd sail down to the Black Sea, and then, from the Black Sea, go to Byzantium, and from there, like Italy, whatever. And that was way cheaper than, just like shipping it by land, even in, neighboring Poland. Sea transport was something like, 1/20th the price of land transport. So, as a result, like everyone in kind of the Dnieper River Valley, ended up kind of sharing their own, language, sharing culture, religion, everything. Further to the west, they actually had different rivers that they would kind of, connect to. You had some of them were connected to like the Vistula, especially in Lviv, all the way in the far west. So they were always like more Polish influenced and Catholic. Some of them, were like the Dniester River, and even further west, you even had some of them, the Rusins, who are some of my own ancestors, who actually like went through Hungary, like on the Danube River, with like Austria and Hungary and Romania and stuff. So those people had like always their own religion, their own dialects, different like church hierarchy and everything, especially, after the Mongols like killed everyone. They were only ruled by Russia really after 1945. They're never part of the Russian Empire. The last kind of time they were unified with Russia was back in the 1100s. And even in the 1100s, they were like fighting with the, other Eastern Slavic peoples, who became the Russians. So, very distinct identity. And they absolutely, like a lot of them, were actually under Polish rule at the time, immediately prior to World War II. And the Poles were very repressive. They were like hanging them. They launched like these punitive raids where they'd like burn down Ukrainian towns and like leave them homeless and destroy their crops and stuff. And it was just like 600-year-old hatred. Like they'd always been ruled by the Poles, and every chance they get, they would just rise up and kill all the Poles they could possibly kill. And they hated Poles more than they hated Jews, and they hated Jews quite a bit too. So that's really saying something. So as a result, that like western part of Ukraine, those kind of three regions, they are a lot more sympathetic to kind of those people who did. I think there were like 1 million Ukrainians that served the Axis in some capacity, and that's kind of where you'll see like a lot of the Axis sympathies. I don't think it's a majority, but definitely like a significant minority of people there. I really do think Bandera and Voloshin and those other kind of collaborators or guys who attempted to collaborate with the Axis powers were the good guys, and view what they did as good, at the least, because they finally got rid of the Poles who had been oppressing them for 600 years or something.
Okay. And the last question I want to have on Ukraine before we get to the cognitive elite questions is, what do you see as the future of the relationship between Russia and Ukraine? Is Ukraine going to eventually join as the West and be part of NATO like the Baltic countries? Or do you think that there's going to be some type of rapprochement between Russia and Ukraine will return to Russia's orbit, or to some degree it would return to Russia's orbit?
It is very difficult to predict the future, and as you and your listeners are well aware, my prediction record is far from perfect. Again, it's not like a very deep ethnic hatred between Russians and Ukrainians. There certainly are opportunities for rapprochement. It's just difficult to see that happening as long as the United States is so antagonistic to Russia, such a militant foreign policy, and has such influence in the Ukrainian government. One of the oligarchs, Kolomoisky, actually called for federalizing Ukraine. He wanted to give kind of the Donbass autonomy, let them speak Russian. Russia would withdraw its support for the separatists. Ukraine would be able to walk in and take it without too much bloodshed. And then, Russia would give Ukraine $100 billion in aid. And then they'd be friends again. They wouldn't join NATO. They wouldn't be in the, Western Bloc. And everything would kind of go back to the way it was prior to 2013. Now, Kolomoisky, he just ended up under a bunch of FBI investigations and had, all these Western financiers like do whatever they could to destroy him. So, rapprochement due to structural reasons isn't possible in the near run. Another possibility is that after Putin leaves office, the next generation of Russian leadership, which is particularly amongst the highly educated Moscow and St. Petersburg, tends to be much more pro-Western, pro-liberal, less believing in that kind of Russian world that motivated Strokov and the Donbass separatists. It's possible they might just give Donbass back to the Ukraine too and abandon their state sovereignty to be part of the United States' led world order. That could very easily happen in the next decade. And the third possibility, is that China is going to be the wild card. That they will take Taiwan, and in the chaos, Russia will seize the Donbass and possibly more of eastern Ukraine and turn Ukraine into a rump state.
Interesting. When China is starting to do that in other parts of Europe, with Serbia, there is a kind of colonization China is undergoing in Serbia. They're like building bridges and other structures in that country, and Serbia has to pay for it. So there is like an interesting relationship, and that could very well happen in Ukraine. I don't know if they will, because America has decided for the present time, maybe if that could happen with a different administration, but under the past three administrations, or at least the people who've been running the State Department and the CIA and other important institutions, they've decided they want to keep Ukraine within America's orbit, with Russia out of it. I don't know if they let it be colonized by China, especially with the security state viewing China as the number one enemy, but they don't know how to deal with the Chinese threat at all, because our economy depends on China. So that is like interesting things to happen with Ukraine going forward. But the one sad thing about this is like Ukrainian nationalists are interesting, but it is a country that is very much dependent on a foreign benefactor in order to survive, and it has to pick one of these three, and it can't be its own little independent nation. It has to pick one. If otherwise, it would be carved out by Russia, or collapse, or it wouldn't survive without a foreign benefactor. So that's something to keep in mind there, even though that is like a sad state for Ukrainian nationalists, but that is just the way it is. Moving on from Ukraine, we can now get to the cognitive elite questions. As a reminder, you too can get the power to ask me questions or suggest guests and topics if you sign up for the cognitive elite option at Highly Respected Substack, and that is at highlyrespected.substack.com. And we've got two questions from one person, both very different subjects. I'm not sure if Nemets is going to have a lot of input on these questions, but we'll see. This comes from Julian, or maybe Julian. We have a very diverse audience at Highly Respected, so we're gonna, it could be Julian or Julian, but we'll call him Julian instead. He said, "Hi Scott, what is up with Con Inc.'s war on incels? See reaction to recent Fuentes interview. Why do they care so much if a young, normal-looking guy isn't having sex or in virtuous courtship?" This is an interesting subject. Last week or so, all of conservatives erupted over this hilarious interview that Nick did on The Blaze. This woman, I'm forgetting her name, but it doesn't matter. She was very, very aggrieved. You could just see the pent-up anger and tension she had when she began to launch at Nick with these questions. And she's just like, "Have you ever been in a relationship with a woman?" And Nick just like nonchalantly is just like, "No." It's like, I burst out laughing when I saw that, because it's like, of course he's gonna say that, and then she's just like going on a rant. It's like, how can you have any idea about women if you've never had an experience with a woman? He just says casually, like, "I'm having an experience with a woman right now," and that didn't really make the woman happy. But all of conservatives and a lot of Populist Inc. just honed in on this, and like, how can this guy be taken seriously if he's not having sex? Why is he not having sex? And a lot of these people who are dumping on him are like guys who are single or in their 40s or in 30s, who are nothing to be, these guys have nothing going on. They're just their whole life value, or that the fact like, oh, I have sex, is that they, managed to convince a 5 to have sex with them 3 years ago or 4. And this is what defines themselves. And this is what makes them think that they're better than Nick Fuentes, and he's an incel. And this guy just can't get women. I think like with Nick, it is like an intentional choice. I don't want to, go into, Nick's personal life, or whatever. But I don't think this is a result of just him being, a weirdo who's like, will you please come up and make out with me, girl? And then he just like fails at that. It is just simply that it's like a choice in that regard. And it also like, it's also succumbing to the woman's demands for what political opinion she should take seriously. As I've always pointed out, women on the internet, their common argument is basing it around the sexual status of men. Of like, they always like use the insults of like emphasizing like, you're a basement dweller, you're an incel, you're a loser. That's like all that I have. I always like to share a meme where it's a woman thinking of like insults, and it's like basement dweller, loser, incel. And that's what women do. And this is what the woman was doing in this regard. And you generally associate this arguments with liberal women, but conservative women use it as well. And with her perspective is that Nick and people like him can't give an opinion on gender relations unless they've had a girlfriend before, unless they have had done this before. And it's also very weird that conservatives react into this, because I've seen conservatives, a lot of the normal conservatives who were, jumping on Nick for his response, were also jumping on other people, who've said like things about like, oh, you need to have sex before marriage. And like, we absolutely do not have sex before marriage, and I'm, saving myself for marriage. So conservatives still supposedly celebrate that idea. And, you would think that Nick is doing that by saying he's not had the type of experience with a woman that the host was saying. But then they, cynically use that against him to just like declare him an incel and stuff. So what's really motivating it is that there are a lot of losers in Conservative Inc. and even in Populist Inc. And they think that the fact that they once had a relationship with a woman several years ago, and the woman is nothing to write home about, but that makes them better than these 18-year-old incels or whatever. And it's a way to signal their status as like being alpha men or whatever, just because of that one experience. And they have this anger over it. And, in our society, male celibacy is looked down upon. It's like, you're a loser if you're a male celibate. And regardless of whether it's voluntary or involuntary, you're looked down upon as a loser. And people like to uphold this as like the one way that gives them value and makes them seem like a cool person, is that the fact that some long ago they were able to have sex. And you'll always see this among irony leftists too. They'll be like these fat neck-bearded losers, and they'll talk about like they'll be in my mentions or other person's mentions where the person is clearly much better looking than them, and they'll be like, you need to have sex, I have sex all the time. And I'm like, I don't want to have that mental image in my head of that. But people just like, people do that on the internet. I do find it funny and telling that Conservative Inc. and Populist Inc. had a meltdown over this, much more so than liberals and leftists. And it's just a way of like condemning much younger people for not having sex and then pretending that they're the losers. But the real losers are these 35-year-old guys in Conservative Inc. or 40-year-old guys who are not married and aren't like having many options out there. But the fact that they one time had sex makes them feel that they're superior to Nick and to those incels out there. But they're not. That's the conclusion I want to have of that. It was just really annoying. But I found the whole controversy very good content. So I don't know, Nemets, do you have any take on this? I don't know if you do. Feel free to offer your opinion on this if you have one.
Not my place to judge. I'm not a priest.
Oh, that's a good answer. I like that answer. But yeah, I think that with the concluding thought, it's stupid. And it was only 15 years ago where conservatives were promoting abstinence-only sex education, and now they're promoting the idea if you're like a young guy and you're not out there having sex all the time or whatever, that you're somehow a weirdo and a loser. But at one point in time, they were promoting as their actual agenda under George W. Bush that everyone should be abstinent until marriage, and that's what we should teach in schools. and now it's just changed to it's just changed for the time. So that is something interesting there. The conservatives have moved more with the general culture on sex and gender issues, and it goes along even with the radically changing views on LGBT issues and other things. So that is probably a subject for another time, but I did think that whole ordeal was funny. Now, this next question, I don't think Nemets will have any response on. I don't think he's a metal fan, but Julian also asked, what are your top 5 old school death metal albums? Now, this is a fantastic question that he asked, and I always encourage people to ask these kind of questions from the cognitive elite. And I thought deeply about this answer, and I only wanted to get really short answer because, of course, most of the podcast has been about Ukraine, and Nemets is probably not going to have any recommendations here, even though we will let him have a say at the end. So the 5 albums I would recommend as my favorites are just off the top of my head, and I had to whittle it down to 5. So the 5 are Morbid Angel, Altars of Madness, Bolt Thrower, Fourth Crusade, Amorphous, The Corellian Isthmus, and some people may remember is that me talking about that being a great album is what got me blocked by Christopher Rufo for some reason. Fourth, Atrocity, Toda Sehnsucht. It's supposed to be longing for death. That's what it means in German. I probably mispronounced that a little bit. All the lyrics are in English, but they were insisted on it being Toda Sehnsucht in the album title, but some album titles is Longing for Death. And the final one is Dismember Like an Ever-Flowing Stream. So those are my 5 favorites I had. There's a few others that I wanted to include. I wanted to include an Entombed album, but it wasn't in the top 5. And I also wanted to include an At the Gates album. But At the Gates, they're a little bit different from old school death metal, even though they were around at that time in the early 90s and late 80s. Well, not in the late 80s, but the early 90s. But they're more seen as melodic death metal, which is its genre in itself. So those are the 5 I recommend. Nemets, how about you just give your opinion about metal, and then we'll conclude on this podcast.
Got a really pro take in metal, just like I do in all music. I like Sabaton, honestly. I know they get a lot of trash, but they're good in my book.
Yeah, I think Sabaton's all right. I think they're a little cheesy, but it's like okay. It's good meme music. I understand the appeal of it, and people want to hear great historical subjects, about Sweden invading Russia and other great subjects that they talk about. So I understand with the appeal of Sabaton. I will not say that that's pro taste. That's just a sign that you play a lot of real-time strategy games. That's all, and there's nothing wrong with that whatsoever. If you play real-time strategy games, you should not be ashamed of that. But that is all the time we have for Highly Respected today. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Nemets, any final words, and how can the good people follow you?
I can just go to Twitter and search at Peter_Nemets, like the Admiral. And
it's and the name is spelled differently on the handle. It's PETER_NIMITZ. Is that correct?
Yes.
All right. And his name, but on the username is just Nemets, NEMETS. And so give him a follow. Make sure you follow. It's some people get very, Nemets posts some controversial takes. So some people may complain about it, but I'm not going to listen to your complaints. So don't try to bother me in the YouTube comment section. But that's all the time we have for today. Make sure you like and subscribe to this channel. I know you love the content. So until next time, stay respected.